All right, guys. Well, I'm really excited today. We've managed to book George on here to speak with us on the podcast again. We did a voice event with George ages ago. I can't exactly remember how long ago it was, but it was like one of the most popular voice chats we've ever done in here. Loads of people
Mm,
have said since that they really want to, do one of those sorts of chats again, and they want to ask George a bunch of questions. So
mm.
unfortunately, we didn't. I didn't send a message in here that this event would be happening, so it is kind of a little bit last minute, and there was some. There's a little bit of confusion with the time zones and everything, but it's happening now. And if you're here in the voice chat right now listening, there will be some time at the end. If you've got questions, you'll be able to raise your hand and ask them to George, or just put questions out
Mm,
for general discussion. Um,
mm.
just in case you guys don't know who George is, he's basically a very long term Supermemo user. I think, George, you started using Supermemo back in like high school, right?
Right, yeah, just after I finished high school, about 2006.
Right. And there's a little bit of a mention in the Supermemo wiki, like some of the Supermemo.wiki, no, not Supermemo.wiki, Supermemo Guru articles, that you sort of co-invented incremental writing.
Right, yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I just use like I do a lot of writing in my incremental reading, so I guess that's where it sort of started.
right, right.
Mm.
And right now, you're also working on kind of a new incremental reading system called Dendro.
Right, yeah, that's right.
That's awesome. So,
And actually, I don't know if this is too like inside baseball, but that voice chat you mentioned, in a lot of ways, I think that voice chat permanently changed my life, like permanently altered the trajectory of my life. Because if I hadn't shown up for that, or if that didn't occur, I wouldn't have met George, or at least not met him at that time, and we wouldn't have linked up. And now I'm actually a co-founder of Dendro as well, and we work together every single day on that. So that voice chat, I don't know exactly who I have to thank for that. I think Raj was the one that set that up, or what. But that that literally permanently altered my life. I cannot believe it. I've thought of it sometimes, and it was literally the distinction between clicking one button to join and not. That's what it all came down to. I mean, obviously, you could break it down at any other point, but just thinking of it that way is kind of surreal to me. So anyway, yeah, that voice chat was hugely important in my life.
beautiful. All right. Well,
Yeah, it was a great experience for me too, and I did I sort of forgot, but yeah, that's where Xander and I met for the first time, and now
Yeah,
yeah, we do work together all the time. So
yeah.
and it was also great to just like actually speak to other SuperMemo users around the world because
Mm,
this sort of community, didn't exist at the time I started
right,
using SuperMemo.
yeah.
right.
Oh,
See,
yeah.
that's a great point because back in those days, could you find anybody else that was using it?
Um, Not really. I mean, I found a Facebook group, but it was pretty dead.
Mm,
I think it was only when I started writing my procedural learning blog that I got some people reaching out
mm,
over email. So that was good too. That was about
mm.
2010, I think.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah, that blog, that's still, in my view, one of the best resources for that kind of thing and just more general ideas. Like you gave some analogies of fluency about like a deck of cards and how not all the cards can be at the top of the deck at once. You know what I mean? And
Right,
I
right.
a lot of those analogies within there and the ideas you put forth in there, to me, those are still hugely valuable. And I don't know, it was such a long time ago that I would have thought there would have been more pop up. And I guess there have been a couple, but anyway, I still think that's a hugely valuable resource.
Yeah, it was a great way to start sort of developing my own ideas around the incremental learning process, and
Mm,
it actually started when my message was, and I said, like, how do I use SuperMemo for learning skills? And he said, just experiment. So that was like, he didn't give me any advice. He said, just
mm,
try it for yourself. Um, and I think, that's part of the whole philosophy now that's on SuperMemo Guru is like basically learn for yourself, self-directed learning.
mm,
Other people might give you advice or ideas, but at the end of the day, each person's got to build their own mental models. So that
mm,
was helpful in my path too.
mm. Actually, speaking of that, do you still maintain those procedural learning items?
So that's a good question. So at some point I imported them to my general collection because I used to keep them in a separate collection. And in general, over the years, I've found that if I have more than one collection, I'll just start neglecting all the others. Like
Yeah.
I like to
general
log
life
into
advice as
Supermemo.
well.
Right. Yeah, it's like it's so much easier to just have a routine where you just go on and do one thing. Whereas if I have like a procedural collection or like a music collection and another one, then I have to set up like 2 or 3 or 4 routines. So, but one of the problems that I came across was the prop problem, which is like I don't want to be like getting up from my chair and getting a basketball to do some basketball items and getting my violin to do some violin items or whatever. So there was that problem, which eventually meant that there was some that I maintained and some that I didn't. So like I had some stuff on Rubik's cubes, which in the long term I didn't care about so much. I had other ones on maths, which the maths ones now on my Surface Pro where I do Supermemo, I use just pen to do those. I use a stylus, so those are in my general collection now. The violin ones, I those are the only ones I kept separate because that could be integrated with the violin practice routine, so it didn't need its own routine. And guitar was another one I had, which yeah, I don't even know where my guitar is right now, so I'll let that one go. But I think that's the nature of incremental learning in general. Like even with my declarative stuff, there's plenty of stuff I've dismissed or deprioritized over time.
Right.
What do you think were the most sort of successful experimentations with this procedural learning sort of system?
Yeah, it's interesting that like well, I guess in the long term, because now it's been like 10 years or so, and my life is totally different to back then. I do other things outside of Supermemo. So like again, like declarative learning, there's just things that are still part of my life, and there's things that aren't anymore. So right now, I still teach, and I still maths is still one of the subjects I teach, and so is physics, and so the engineering, the procedural engineering items that I have in Supermemo have kept my math skills up, and that's been useful outside of Supermemo. And it's been great to be able to look like have a look at some complex maths problem and be able to work on it without like having to go away for a day to remind myself what all this stuff is. And then with violin, I found it interesting to see that the items have actually worked really well over the long term for the ones that I did or I have built strong memory stability for, and that I can pick up certain pieces and play certain passages, which in the start were quite challenging.
Wow. Okay, that's really interesting. I'm very interested in the violin items, like in terms of what are they? Are they like scales, or I always thought that like more of an incremental reading style of scheduling for music would be really interesting. For example, like doing like incremental composition, like you record 30 seconds, for example, on the guitar of a riff you thought was really cool, and then you just slowly develop it over time. So more like incremental reading or incremental writing. But what were the items that you were making for violin? Were they like scales, like I said, or something else?
Yeah, there was a combination, and there were definitely scales there. I also did use that sort of incremental learning approach where I started off with a new piece that I'd want to learn, and then I'd basically start playing through it and see where I get stuck, and then that bit where I got stuck, I would extract that by taking a screenshot of the sheet music, and then that's like that would be a way for me to say to myself, here's a little passage I want to practice all on its own, and come back to that later and just focus on that passage. So that gave me a way to go, okay, out of this like I don't know 2 or 3 page piece, there's these short sections, they're almost like paragraphs. There's these short sections that I just want to practice in isolation, and because there's some technically challenging aspect to them. And then when I came back to those sections, then I applied some of the approaches that I mentioned in my blog, like I'd create my own variations. I'd cut out even smaller sections from those paragraphs, like recursive extracting. And then, so that I'm not even talking about items there. I'm just talking about like topics basically. But instead of reading through the topics, I'd try playing through them on my violin.
Very cool. Do you think there's some way
So
you
what
could?
is the?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sander. Go ahead.
I just want to ask real quick. What is the maintenance cost of that? Like, does it take a huge amount of time to review it? Do you do it every day? Do you do it a couple times a week? Like, what does it actually look like?
Yeah. Yeah, it's always just like being a bit clunky. Basically just using image tools in SuperMemo. Taking photos and uploading them is not the smoothest. Like, there's no simple way to do it. You just take a photo, maybe email it or save it on Dropbox or something, and then copy paste it in. So I generally try and go for the whole page, and then that would give me the raw data, and then I could use the image extracting tools, where you alt click and then extract a part of the image. So, and then I wouldn't want to do that in the middle of playing, so I'd have to just make a note of stuff to do later, and so I guess mostly there was this upfront capital cost of take a piece, scan or take a photo of the whole thing and upload it, and then the rest of it's a little bit easier to do, but not that fun still. And so I found it most useful for the most challenging bits, essentially. And one thing that I often recommend to people using SuperMemo just normally is don't extract everything. Not everything's important. Extracting less is also a way of prioritizing. And in this case, I had a really good incentive to extract less because it's a bit fiddly to do. So,
Right.
from a whole piece, I wouldn't be trying to take out every single passage. I'd choose the ones that I really want to.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice actually, because a lot of people think, and in some way I think Woz propagates this or promotes this way of thinking. It's like, oh, incremental reading is the ultimate tool set. So if you prioritize properly, just extract however much you want. It literally doesn't matter. You can extract everything, and as long as you prioritize properly, you're going to end up in a good place. And I sort of don't think that's right. Like, it's possible to extract way too much stuff, and not everything is worth reading multiple times and processing into items and all of this. And you might be better off just longer term psychologically in terms of managing it if you extracted fewer things. But it's kind of a hard thing to convey.
Yeah. Was
Yeah, yeah.
Was always says like you can't overwhelm an incremental reader or something like that.
Yeah, he told me that when I first started emailing with him. He would email me a lot, I would email him a lot, and at one point I said, I'm sorry for all the emails, and he says you can't overwhelm an incremental reader, and it's like, dude, I don't believe that's true. I just don't believe, like, it's possible to do it. It must be.
Yeah. Even now I find
Yeah,
even now I find that there's like a psychological impact of having too much stuff in the queue. Even now, after all this time, after even writing about that, how that is like, kind of like a you shouldn't worry about that. You should sort of embrace the overload. I still fall prey to that as well. I still have to hide the status bar because looking at it sometimes makes me uneasy. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's interesting. That's an interesting sort of, I guess maybe a segue, at least for later, into Dendro, because that was one of the initial key design decisions, was not to put an outstanding bar. I think I think in earlier SuperMemo it made sense because there was this idea that you have to finish all your repetitions. But and that was to do with just items. But with modern SuperMemo, at least, the algorithm is such that it's much more flexible and it'll adapt if you don't do your repetitions on time.
Mm.
And so rather than you sort of following the machine decisions and listening to SuperMemo tell you when to do everything, it's more that you say, I want to spend some time learning, and it'll help you spend that time efficiently. And so we want to basically encourage that perspective in Dendro where it doesn't feel like this anxiety. It feels like, oh, I want to go do some learning.
Mm.
Just like if you pick up a book, it doesn't tell you, you know, you need to read 40 pages today.
Oh, yeah. I always used to hate it in school. Like if I was sat in a chair that was facing a wall with a clock on it, because it's like you see the time ticking down. Somehow it just stops you from getting into any sort of flow. And it's the same with reading a book. Like I would always try and like read a book in such a way that my thumbs would cover the numbers, because when you're just seeing sort of it's almost like you see the time ticking away in that sort of sense. Or, I don't know, there's some sort of psychological effect that I really don't like from
Yeah.
seeing the numbers tick down. And yeah, I don't know, but I definitely support that decision to like leave the status bar out of it. Are there any other sort of metrics like that that you don't like in SuperMemo that you want to keep out of Dendro?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's a really big sort of a big area that Xander and I and Ollie, who also works on Dendro, often discuss. And that is the misleading metrics in SuperMemo and in other apps. When I say misleading, I don't mean they necessarily have zero value, but the way that they're often used and interpreted can lead to like essentially suboptimal learning. So the one that we're talking about now, the outstanding Q, if we're talking about in Anki as well, it's a similar problem where you're just aiming to get the repetitions done, and trying to get that stuff done. It's like quantity over quality. It means you're just trying to get to the end of the queue. You're happy to spend less time thinking about things, and I don't think any of those decisions are good. And so another metric that sort of adds to this problem is counting the number of items that you create. So aiming just for having lots of items and equating that to lots of knowledge, I think, is another really misleading metric, and that goes hand in hand with that outstanding queue.
I think that's such an important point because the number of items thing, that's a really easy one to latch onto. Even if you're like really into this non-coerciveness, free learning kind of thing, it's easy to say, oh, well, the more items I have, the better that is. But I remember reading in the incremental reading documentation, it says something like, you know, just 3 well-selected items per day can do wonders or something like that, you know? And I always thought that's kind of nonsense. Like, how can that be true? Like, 3 items per day, you're really underutilizing this amazing tool and the efficiency and all this. But after using it for so many years now, I really, really understand what he means by that, and it is really true. I'd rather have 1,000 great items than 50,000 sort of bad to mediocre items, which is what I think most of the items that people try to make in pursuit of hitting some number, like, oh, I want to make X number of items per day or whatever. I think those are, I don't know. I just don't think that's good. And over time, I've really internalized, and now that resonates really deeply with me. Like, it's way more about the quality and the importance and the applicability of each item than it is about maximizing your number of items.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's maybe why you and I both have our initial intervals around like 30 days, is because we're possibly a lot more selective than a lot of users are about what we actually add. And also, I think there's also was put out maybe 6 months ago an article about the maximum number of items that you can store in human memory. And a really interesting conclusion from that article was that if you're using SuperMemo, you're not necessarily, and this goes counter to pretty much everything people think about supermemory, but you're not necessarily going to learn more than anyone else. And that conclusion came from the fact that over Waz's entire 30-something years of using SuperMemo, his rate of knowledge acquisition has been pretty much entirely linear. And when you're measuring knowledge acquisition as number of items, that's not what he means. He's talking about number of items times the retrievability of each item. So
right.
if you have I don't know, 10 items of which you remember 10% of each of them, or you have one item that you remember 100% of, the sort of equivalent in that sense.
Right.
And so you can just be basically adding a whole bunch of stuff and forgetting most of it, even in SuperMemo. But when I say forgetting, I mean the retrievability is low.
Right.
So at the end of the day, SuperMemo really has its value in helping you choose what you're learning. That's really the core value. And part of this item count problem is actually discounting all the stuff that happens before you start practicing those items. So all the reading, all the thinking, all the note taking, that stuff is actually really, really important. And that's what we focus more on in Dendro. In fact, in some ways we want to de-emphasize the items, not because they don't work, of course they work, but because the stages preceding the items are what give value to the items that you create.
That's really
I agree with
interesting.
that completely. And I think maybe someone else remembers this better, but Woz, I think, has mentioned before that incremental writing may be even more valuable to him on the whole than incremental reading. And he phrased it something like it can help you shape raw knowledge into coherent models or something akin to that concept. And I think all these other things, like you say, the thinking of it, the writing, the note taking, all that is so much more valuable than just oh, I'm just trying to convert everything into items. To me, that's such a lower level goal, and this other stuff that it facilitates. And really the core of it is that it's one place theoretically where you can import all kinds of learning, and it's prioritized, and you can break it into pieces and deal with those pieces independently over time. I think that's the core of it. It's not like you're trying to get everything into items, or you're trying to get everything into this state or that state. You're trying to learn things over time, prioritized manner in one place. Roughly that's the value add.
Right. Exactly. Yep.
So it seems like number of items and the status bar, those are examples of poor sort of metrics for learning in an incremental reading system. Do you think it's possible to design a good metric? Because it seems to me like a metric would be a really good metric of learning has to be sort of holistic, and it has to involve things that take place outside of the system. Just to give an example, I guess for language learning, obviously you can count the number of items you have, and that might correspond to your knowledge of the vocabulary and how close you are to a native speaker's vocabulary and so on. But ultimately the a reasonable measure of success has to take into account things that can't really be measured inside the system. So for example, being able to read a book, I suppose, or converse with a native speaker. It seems like those things that are really, those are what you really want. Those are the progress metrics that you really want to achieve. So given that they sort of take place outside of the system, is it possible to create a good metric, or are we just doomed?
Yeah, well, it's challenging to create a good metric. There's one more sort of misleading metric that comes to mind, and that's in some new incremental reading systems. They report what percentage of articles you've read. Like you've read 30% of this article, or you've read 70% of that one. And the whole point of incremental reading is really to forget about whether or not you're finishing things.
Yeah.
And instead of focusing on the inputs and how much you've read, focus on the outputs and how much you're learning. So that's another misleading one that comes to mind. In terms of,
especially because it's possible to have gotten 95% of the value while only reading 3% of an article. That's
Exactly.
why that's a bad metric.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of a good metric, I think the more I think about incremental learning and the value of it, I think it comes down to the self-directed aspect, and that means that really what we want to do is put some tools in the hands of users to decide for themselves if they're getting value out of it. So for myself using SuperMemo, I think reflection plays a core part in how I judge if it's being valuable. And if I look at the item count, I don't know, it sort of reminds me that I did some work, and that's useful. I like to sometimes look at the usage time and make sure that I'm actually putting enough effort in to, because if you don't put any time in, you're not going to get anything out. But at the same time, that's not telling you how much you're getting out of it. So for me using SuperMemo, my main progress metric is just my own reflection. At the same time, I think there's also an aspect when we're talking about progress here, there's an aspect where you want to focus on the journey and just the destination. And so it's also about enjoying the time that you are spending learning and not just sort of slugging through it and feeling like it's this chore and that you're going to be a genius, 10 years down the track. I don't think that's a healthy way to do it.
I've been misled.
Okay, I have one more point. It's sort of I guess a devil's advocate point. There's this quite famous paper in machine learning. I think it's called the bitter lesson or something. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I haven't heard that, no.
Okay, it's basically talking about the state of machine learning and what's brought the most progress in the field so far. And essentially what it comes down to is what machine learning engineers have found over the past, I don't know how many years of machine learning research, but what they found to be most effective was simply providing models with more data rather than working on a more sophisticated algorithm. So I'm wondering if there's an analogy to be made here that sort of refutes your point about, item selection being more important than just item quantity. Perhaps, I don't know, maybe there's some intrinsic, really fundamental difference between the way we learn and a neural network learns that the analogy doesn't hold. But I don't know, do you get what where I'm sort of coming from there? Do you think that perhaps if you do learn enough items that would result in more intelligence over the long term or something than just item selection?
Yeah, I mean that's a interesting question, but I actually see no contradiction there because in a machine learning system, you pass out a whole bunch of data, and then the neural networks generalize from that data. They basically prioritize and deprioritize what's coming in. Without doing that, they're just going to remember everything and not actually end up with a model. In what's actually happening in the neural network is this data comes in and it starts working out which parts are more important, which parts are less important, which parts are the key features, and which parts are details.
Right.
And so the irony for me often is looking at machine learning and going, that was inspired by how the brain works. That was inspired by human learning, and humans aren't doing this anymore. At least they're not trying to. And so actually, I think it's the exact same process, and that neural network approach is what we should be doing in incremental reading,
right,
and making those decisions that the machines are making too.
So it seems that in neural networks as well as in the human brain, forgetting is the most important thing. You're trying to forget the details that don't matter, I guess.
Right, yeah. I mean, you're trying to forget. I think forgetting is really valuable for that reason. But the forgetting doesn't just happen totally randomly. You're going to forget things that are not meaningful, and they're not meaningful because they don't link and integrate well with the other things, the other data that you've come across.
Right.
So in terms of the bitter lesson, I actually agree with it 100% because the increment, and that's what we were talking about before. The selection is the fact that you have all this data coming in through incremental reading, and you have to make a selection about what stays in the items. Now, so I think it's actually the exact same thing happening. You want lots of data in the incremental reading process.
Mm.
And in terms of the algorithm, I think that's where the super memo algorithm is less important than that learning process.
Mm.
And I think so huge leaps have been made from like SM2 algorithm all the way up to SM18. And it works in a totally different way and much, much better with SM18. At the same time, I would rather a capable and competent learner with SM2 rather than someone who's just trying to cram 10,000 flashcards with SM18.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree with
So,
that. But I do want to note, I've seen Woz make a similar point, essentially saying because of generalization, this property of neural networks, it is possible to consume a bunch of low quality information and then convert it eventually into something quite valuable. I mean, obviously, it's better. The whole point of trying to minimize the low quality information you consume is to make room for the higher quality information. And so if you're not increasing your consumption of high quality information after reducing your consumption of low quality information, then of course it's not going to work right. You know what I mean? Like you're trying to offset it that way. But also, I do think there is something to be said for just try to learn a lot. And if your options are a bunch of low quality information or none, I would say read a bunch of low quality information. Like, of course, if you're reading a bunch of books, you would want to have a mix of fiction and nonfiction, unless you're me, in which case I don't read any fiction at all. But let's just say, right, you were reading only fiction. I think everybody would agree there's a lot of value to be had or to be gained from reading nonfiction books, right? But if the option is between reading only fiction or nothing at all, then of course, reading fiction is going to improve your life more than doing nothing. So I think there's something to be said about that. But of course, if we're speaking in terms of optimization or getting closer to the optimum, then being selective while still trying to give yourself enough input to figure out what is truly important so that you can improve your selection mechanism, I think that's a better approach and closer to optimum.
yeah, I think the challenge for a lot of people that I see is not so much that they're lacking high quality information, but they lack the ability to discern what's high quality. Because
Right.
often this is, like as was says, some bad habits from school, where people often perceive as high quality the information that is least least meaningful, and that's because it's like here's some fancy words, here's some fancy words that you haven't heard before. So by knowing these words, you're going to feel like you know more. But really, what matters is the ideas underlying those words. And so, yeah, I think the challenge is not lacking access to high quality information. With the internet, we all have access to high quality information. I think the challenge is being able to tell what's high quality and what's not.
I really like that point. It links to something that I watched really recently. It was like technology select committee. It was Dominic Cummings, who used to be the an advisor to the Prime Minister here in the UK, and he's looking to set up an organization called ARIA, which is like the UK's version of the US's DARPA, which created the internet. And
Right.
he was talking about people who fund like fundamental research and like the kinds of research that led to the internet, like DARPA. And he's talking about how those sorts of funders who are able to select those risky projects that are going to pay off like in a huge way and like hundreds of trillions of value in the future kind of way, like the internet, those people are much more rare than the actual people who like the people who are being invested in, who are actually going to create the technology. And so it's almost as if these funders, they have to have like a level of taste. And he was talking about how taste was really what it was in these funders, because they couldn't like pin it down to something like that could be measured externally. Like all that they could come up with for the reason why these funders had picked these projects and why they had continued to do so over like a long stretch of time was just taste. And so do you think it's the same way with learning material? Do you have to have sort of innate, refined taste to select the finest learning quality, learning material, or do you think this is something that can be, I don't know, developed or acquired over time?
Oh, I mean, absolutely can be developed. Like, I think it's different if you're choosing people for a job. You want to choose people who already have reached a certain level of competence. But if you're talking about any skill, you're going to reach that competence over time. So if you're employing a doctor, you want someone who has medical skill, but no one's born with medical skill. So if you're employing someone who's making these funding decisions, then you want someone who's already reached that level of skill. But I definitely think it's something that can be developed. And that's what I think the essence of the self-directed learning process is, not that we all start with knowing everything, but it goes back to that bit of lesson that you mentioned. It's like, as we get data and we make our initial decisions about what's important and what's not, that helps us build initial models and filters. And then as we use those models and filters, we pick out other information, link it in, and so we have this cycle that goes with collecting information, making sense of it, and then using that to make our next round of decisions. And this iterative process, I think, is really what learning is all about. So, I can't even consider the idea that it's not possible to learn that, because that's what my conception of learning is.
100% agree with that. And I want to note, unschooling, as it's called now, is not a perfect solution to this. It's not like I came out of the womb knowing exactly what's important and what's not. So even though I never went to school, I still don't perfectly select knowledge, I'm sure. I kind of view it like, I don't know, it's kind of like self-knowledge. For example, as you age, you recognize certain patterns in your behavior. Like, I tend to do these kinds of things. If I leave a box of Oreos on my desk, I tend to eat all of them, right? And so now I know about myself. I don't leave boxes of Oreos on the desk, so I don't eat them all, right? And as you learn over years, you come across information, especially with incremental reading, you see things over and over again, and you go, oh wow, it's been a couple of years since I learned that, and I haven't used it even once. It was never useful to me. I was only learning that for some weird, obscure reason, or just pure pleasure of curiosity, or whatever it is, right? And I never used it. And then, because of the way the brain works, you start to develop a pattern in the mind, a kind of intuition for the character of things that you're just learning for the sake of it, and not because they meaningfully contribute to some goal. You know what I mean? And I view the difference between, like, okay, just to draw another analogy between hiring somebody, you can hire somebody purely because they're pleasant to be around, right? That doesn't mean they're going to meaningfully contribute to your company. And because you only have so many resources, and in life your resources is your time, essentially. In learning, that's your primary resource. You can't just continually hire people just because they're pleasant to be around. You have to hire people that provide some value to the company. And so I view it that way. You can learn things just for pleasure, but it's much more useful over time to learn things that meaningfully contribute to some goal. And that's why I believe a kind of cheat code for getting this skill set more quickly, at least in one area at a time, is to have goals that direct your learning. So I'm trying to do this, therefore everything I learn in this particular area is in pursuit of figuring that out, or solving this problem, or doing X thing. You know what I mean? So I think goals around your learning and project-based learning are probably the quickest way to improve your selection of knowledge.
Right. And I think going back to your Oreo example, that reminds me of something I saw on this Discord recently. I think it was maybe a golden nugget, but something I've been thinking about as like a really good conception of self-directed learning. And it's this little story about someone who's seeking wisdom, and they go and find this monk up in the mountains and say, like, what's the secret to life? And the monk says, good judgment. and then they say, well, okay, and how do I get good judgment? And then the monk says, bad judgment. And that's exactly like your Oreo's example. You start off doing things in a suboptimal way, and then you reflect and you realize, okay, I want to do things better.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a piece on my blog about wholesome pleasure, which sort of I think seems perhaps a little bit out of place with all the other learning related articles that I've written because I haven't built on it yet. But I think having this conception of what is pleasure and what's wholesome pleasure is really useful because I think there's things that give us this sort of like I guess brief pleasure, like eating a whole bunch of Oreos, and then afterwards we might feel sick or like.
Mm.
For me, if I eat too many carbs, then I feel like a bit mentally dull afterwards. And so
Mm.
it feels pleasurable at the start, but then it doesn't afterwards. Whereas, I don't know, if I have an apple, then it feels good while I'm eating it. I feel good about myself as well. Um,
Right.
and so I think there's what I wrote about in that article is this convergence towards wholesome pleasure, where um, that's actually a core mechanism in self-directed learning, where we start off doing things which seem like a really good shortcut. We take the shortcuts and we try and do the quick fixes, and we try and, you know, memorize a bunch of cards, let's say, that other people have written, a bunch of items, let's say, and then we realize that actually those quick fixes don't make us feel better. They don't actually work in the long term, and
Mm.
they don't make us feel successful. And so then that's the impetus for trying more challenging things, which lead to success that lasts, and that's more wholesome pleasure.
Mm.
Very interesting. Oh,
I
so
think that's a really good point.
it seems like to a large extent, like the learning process is like centered around sort of error correction. So you make a mistake and then you correct it. So I was going to try and bring it back to the whole bitter lesson thing again and say perhaps we should just try and make as many items as possible, make as many mistakes as possible, because then since error correction is like the way we can learn, you'd be making so many mistakes, you'd have so many mistakes to error correct. But I suppose making
Mm.
mistakes doesn't mean you'll necessarily correct them and fix them. So I
If
guess
only.
if only I could just make as many mistakes as possible. I guess so. Since error correction or mistake fixing seems to be so important, do you have any good ways that people can focus on that? Like, I guess one of the things. This is I don't know. Just to give like a simple example, I suppose. Like sometimes I'll notice something I'm doing in SuperMemo isn't the best way to do it. Maybe I'm not using a keyboard shortcut or something like that, but I don't like correct it straight away. I'll like leave it for like a couple of months until I get so sick of doing it the slow way that I'll try to find the keyboard shortcut and do it the fast way from then on. So it's like I'm
Mm.
delaying the sort of error correction, which will speed up my learning. Do you think it's, do you have any thoughts about that? Do you think we should be really like sort of diligent about correcting those sorts of errors or bigger errors?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I wonder if we're thinking about the bitter lesson in a different way because I think that um, I think that another distinction that's really important in this learning process is the distinction between information and knowledge,
Mm.
and that we're just the point of anything in SuperMemo, in our items or topics, is the value of them is what they stimulate in our brain. So if they stimulate good thinking, then that's what matters.
Mm.
Otherwise, it's just data in a computer. So when we're talking about feeding data to machines to help them make decisions, um, the data is the raw input. And if you're sitting on SuperMemo for, I don't know, hours every week, then you're getting a lot of data. And as you're making decisions about what to keep and what to discard, I think that's I'm finding it difficult to express. Maybe I'll need to think about it after this podcast. But I think there's I think there's something happening there between reading stuff on the screen
Mm.
and actually thinking about it in your head, and maybe what we call data for a computer is different than what we call data for humans. Yeah, so anyway, talking about error correction, I still think prioritizing is the main thing. So in your example, like you basically almost said that there's an error that you're making by doing something the slow way, which you didn't correct straight away because you didn't think was that important, probably. And I think that's perfectly good, and I think that's the right way to do it. And what's the point of correcting something that's not even that important? So I think just as in all this other stuff we're talking about, prioritizing and selecting what errors you want to correct is just as important as selecting what else you want to learn.
Right.
I do think it's important to mention this concept of, actually, just real quick before that, how's everybody going for time?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah,
Okay.
all good.
And by the way, if anybody listening has any questions or wants to chime in real quick, you can raise your hand. We'll bring you up for a minute, and we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think it's important to mention this concept of learned helplessness. As long as the reason that you're avoiding doing something that would improve your life is not because you feel helpless to improve it, then I think it's probably okay. And like George says, that's probably just a signal that it's not that important. So your time is better spent elsewhere. Oh, here we go. All alone, guys.
Oh, sorry. I was just typing a message in general. I was just going to say, I was going to reiterate, if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll pull you in.
Yep.
But yeah. Oh, I want to go back to something you brought up, Xander. You brought up like having a goal, having a meaningful goal. How important do you think that is, George, for like good learning in SuperMemo? Has all your learning in SuperMemo been driven by like had a goal at the end of it, or do you allow yourself to do more like exploration with just no goal in sight?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing where like even without trying to necessarily control the process, I think goals have been quite integral and quite important to my learning. But it's hard to explain because it's not so much been about self-discipline or something like that. It's more just been the fact that there's something I really want to do or there's something I really want to learn. And so just naturally, the sort of stuff I import happens to be related to it. So, I sometimes when onboarding new Dendro users, we ask them, what are your goals? What are you trying to learn? And sometimes they have an idea and sometimes they don't. And if you don't, I don't think it necessarily helps to like artificially construct a goal. I think this relates to what we were talking about before about discerning high quality information. Just like so much about good learning is intuitive and it's about intuition and it's about going, I really want to learn that stuff. Like, I want to learn about business or I want to learn about psychology or I want to learn about music and so on. And that just pulls me along. And then without trying to, if I look back at what I've been importing over the past few months, it all tends to be related to a central theme, which has a really, really important function, having that central theme, which is the big picture is in my head. That's a question we often get about Dendro and SuperMemo is like, where's the big picture? The big picture is not something you can write down. It's something that you continuously build in your head. And so that big picture does tend to be related to my goals and the things I'm trying to achieve. But again, I can't sort of construct a goal out of nowhere. It has to be something that I really feel is meaningful.
That big picture note, I think that's really important. And so many people talk about that. Like, oh, how are you gonna keep all the knowledge together if you're breaking it up into these little items or, little short notes that only contain one idea or whatever it is. And first of all, you just have to try it just to recognize that's not how it works. Like the brain is an association machine. That's the whole point of it. If you're learning well, which these systems, Dendro, SuperMemo, incremental reading systems, that's one of the primary mechanisms of it. Like the reason why it's so useful to remember the salient points is so that you can continue to construct that big picture in your mind. Because if you're learning something sufficiently complex, and if it's worthwhile, it probably is complex in some way. The big picture is never done. It's not like, oh, I painted that and now it's ready to go. It's like you're always adding on to it. So of course it's not all going to be written down. And if anybody in the field made an insight, what does that mean to make an insight in the field? That means that your big picture has more pieces than everybody else's, right? So it would not have been possible for someone to hand you the big picture and say, here you go. It was just you learning and then constructing it and putting it all together. So the big picture is never done for anybody in any field ever. That's just a fact of life. And that's the whole point. The whole point is to learn in such a way where you maintain the salient points in the mind and continually glue them together over time so that you can learn more and more things, develop more and more insight, and eventually your models are stronger and stronger and cover more area and you can understand more.
Right. Yeah, so related to that point is this sort of idea of neatness and having everything written down and trying to use SuperMemo or Dendro or whatever system as a reflection of exactly how things are organized in your mind. There's some apps that try and give you options, give you tools to show the links in your mind and to represent those on a computer and to show how this is related to that and this is related to that. And you can, I mean, each neuron, is connected to tens of thousands of other synapses. So trying to represent the knowledge in the same way that it is in the brain would be like an exhausting exercise. And I'm not sure that it would provide much value unless you're a researcher. I think if you're just trying to learn, then you recognize that those links are in your brain, and what you're trying to do with the computer or the paper or whatever tool you're using is to think about things in a way that will reinforce the good links and help you make new ones. And so when you think about it that way, it's like comparing someone who's holding a textbook in their hand and someone who could write a textbook if they wanted to. It's like one person has that information in front of them. It's all nicely, neatly, linearly represented. And the other person has all that knowledge in their brain, and they may have never written it down. It might be a totally new field of study, but all the links are there and the big picture's there in their brain.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I've got
and people often discount just in general. Sorry about that, James.
No, sorry.
I'll just say this real quick. No. People just discount in general, like the value of memory for creative work or more complex things, and they think that it's only useful. I've even heard very obviously bright and educated people in this field of like computer-assisted thinking or whatever you'd call it. I don't really even know what it's called, but they say things like, yeah, spaced repetition is only good for facts and figures. I see this a lot, and it's like, what are you talking about? And that doesn't make any sense. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but on its face, that is a very stupid thing to say. Because if you observe your mind at all in any state, anytime you solve a problem, you're pulling information that's in your mind. I don't understand. I don't understand how you expect to come up with anything new, anything creative, anything that combines multiple pieces if the information doesn't already sit in the mind. I'm not saying it's totally useless to have some stuff externalized in a note system or whatever. There's certainly use cases for that. But to say that memory has no place in creative fields or that spaced repetition is only useful for basic facts and figures, to me is just to totally misunderstand and misrepresent the role of memory in these things.
Right, and here I can make a clearer point about the bitter lesson, which is that you actually, to have a smart machine, you need to feed it data, which it represents in models, and then it uses those models to make decisions. If you don't give it data, it doesn't have models, and it can't make decisions. So if you want Google to recognize what a cat is, you got to show it lots of cats.
A lot.
And yeah, I'll show it a lot of cats, a lot more than a human, I would say. And that's another example where we don't want to actually memorize 10,000 things that are useless. But another connection here is Jeff Hawkins.
Mm.
Hopefully I got the name right.
Yeah.
And his conception of hierarchical temporal memory, which he's got a newer model now, but that model was a model of intelligence. Like his definition of intelligence was hierarchical temporal memory. That we use our memory to predict things. So as you're trying to listen to what someone's saying, you're using your knowledge of that language to try and predict what sort of words might come next. Just like these days, you type something into various apps and they predict what you're going to say next. That's what our human memories do as well, and that's what intelligence is based on. It's based on using your memories to try and work out what's going to happen next.
And Herbert Simon said that decades ago. Talking about how intuition is essentially just memory. You're seeing a situation, it brings to mind similar situations you've seen in the past, and then you can come up with a solution based on that. Like he said that decades ago. So I think this is a settled thing, and I wish people would understand it. Anyway, I'm going to invite Matt Nielson up because he has something to say. Okay. Oh, I thought it would bring him up right away. Apparently, it's just an invite, and he has to accept it. Oh, there we go.
Welcome to the stage, Matt Nielson.
There we go. You guys hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Long time listener, first time caller. How you doing? I was thinking about the connection stuff, and to your point, Xander, it feels like, I don't know. Tell me what you guys think. I was thinking about this morning. That it's just an insufficient introspection into like what a connection actually means. Like when someone says that only facts and figures are good for memory, like I kind of feel like people don't think about the fact that like the only reason a fact feels like a fact is because it's an abstraction that they've grown so used to that it now generalizes to everything. Like the number one, like that is such a generalized abstract concept that most people don't think about like the underlying quality that it's a connection in real life. Like you had to first learn to abstract what the concept of one meant before you could turn it into this generalizable thing. And I feel like it's the same thing. Like as I've been learning programming, like you guys know, I've been dropping connection items about the programming concepts I'm learning. And to me, like it's the exact same thing. It's just learning how to fundamentally abstract out those underlying relational qualities between things, and then using them in a more universal, applicable way that you can get at the underlying quality of something. And I wonder if it's just people haven't sufficiently thought about what a connection actually means. Like they haven't really thought through, I think, what abstraction or generalization means. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I agree with that completely. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, okay. Well, I just had a couple of things to say there. I definitely agree. I think there's a couple of things in there that are important for people to understand, and one of them is the difference that I think actually Xander and I talked about on that voice chat a long time ago, but the difference between learning someone else's facts and learning your own, meaning, as you described, you got to learn what that concept of one is and what it means in the real world before you just memorize that fact. And so coming to your own generalizations and making your own conclusions is can be very, very different. Like if you learn Newton's second law out of a textbook, it can be very different from thinking about it in real life in the first place. And that's not saying that you have to reinvent the wheel for everything, but it is saying that you can't just like take a bunch of information that other people have written down and try and memorize it. So I think that's part of where that misconception comes from, is like thinking that if someone else makes a bunch of flashcards or writes a textbook and you read it, that's the same quality as you actually thinking about it and making the connections yourself. So the second link, I think, is one way I try and phrase it is like, what are you memorizing? If you're just picking up stuff out of a book and memorizing it, then it's possibly going to be quite low quality. If you are actually making an effort to think things through and come to some interesting insight, and then you try and remember that insight, well, you're remembering something more valuable.
Mm. And that relates exactly to that point of the true value is what it makes you think of. That's the whole point. You're trying to think of better things as a result of incremental reading, all these things.
Well, in some sense, it kind of feels like to your point, George, it's not that you have to reinvent the wheel, but you kind of do have to reinvent the principle. You have to internalize the principle for yourself. Like, to use your own example of Newton's second law, like if you learn it, if you just see the formula, force equals mass times acceleration, okay, like I guess that means something. But then you go to push a child on a swing, and then you push an adult on a swing, and suddenly what force and mass and acceleration have to do with each other. So it's like you have to internalize the concept for yourself in order to actually know it.
Oh, yes.
Exactly.
Internalizing like perceptual things that we can actually see and perceive and like pick up and hold, like a plate. It's much easier to have like a really deep understanding of that. It's like once you move on to higher level concepts that don't necessarily have like a concrete thing existing in the real world, like inflation or something like that, something that you can't actually perceive, there has to be a different process for gaining the same level of understanding that you get from like holding a plate. Like I'm literally holding a plate right now and like spinning it around, like understanding physically how the shape of a plate works in the real world. You have to do the same sort of motion in your mind with the concept of inflation. And what's really interesting is that it's possible for us to use like the noun phrase, Newton's second law or whatever, in a sentence and have it be completely coherent, but we don't actually understand what we're saying, if you know what I mean. And so it's possible to understand when to use something grammatically correctly in a sentence and how it relates to every other word in that sentence in a certain sense, but you don't have the actual hierarchical under layer of all of that knowledge that's required, or the entire sort of conceptual chain from Newton's second law right back down to originally where it started, like in the real world, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah. I have 2 points. I take umbrage with the idea that inflation can't be perceived. Okay. I pay way more for a burger now than I did 6 months ago. I can tell you that. And also, James is so dedicated. He ran and got a plate just for this podcast. What a guy. Love him.
Dude, was I the only one still sitting here hoping to hear a plate shattering in the background?
Anyway, it's entirely possible to receive a rule described by someone else and think that you understand it, but it's of no use because you don't understand what the rule is derived from. So I think that's crucially important. And I think all of this relates to all these things about people's relative inability to perceive the source of their own creative ideas or their own solutions to problems or things like this. And then the result is a failure to perceive like what if improved upon would have the most impact. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And this goes back to something we were talking about earlier, which is like how so much of the learning process is based on intuition. So you have to develop a good intuition over time. And also that it's about perceiving like the value of high quality information and high quality knowledge. And a lot of people have difficulty with that because they're used to a whole childhood in school and often in university as well, of being handed things which they've got to remember. They're told it's important, and so they get this association between it. It doesn't have much sense to me, and but it's got some fancy words, and therefore it's important. Whereas actually, meaningful information is simply that. It's just like, oh, that makes sense. Like if you can say, if you learn something, you go, oh, that makes sense. I see that why that's useful. Then it's probably high quality information. Unfortunately, I guess it's still a challenge because I often see, even in school students I teach, that people are used to saying it makes sense even when it doesn't really make sense to them.
Right.
They don't have enough experience with things actually truly making sense.
And also, there's a lot of pressure, like maybe in a school context it's different, but certainly just in life. When someone's explaining something, there's a lot of pressure to just say, "Yep, I get it," so that you can move on to the
Right.
next thing. You know what I mean? And I think that really internalizes, without people recognizing it, this sort of low standard for how
Yeah.
to actually make sense of something. Because, like you say, your whole life consists of someone says something and you just go, "Yep, I get it," and then you just move on to the next thing. And so you have to kind of root that out in yourself to determine whether or not you truly understand something.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, lifting your standards is probably like a really key skill in incremental learning. Is just like over time, slowly um, being comfortable with forgetting, with coming across something and going, yeah, okay, it's interesting, but not that interesting, and moving
Yes.
on. And the more you get used to that skill, the more likely you're going to actually land on the good things and go, oh, wow, this really changes the way I look at things. This is meaningful.
There you go. That's such good advice, dude. That is one of the crucial things, and it relates to a bunch of other things we've talked about, like making fewer extracts and this kind of thing. Not everything is worth remembering, and it's okay. Like information, if something is truly valuable and you learn a lot, it'll probably come up multiple times in various forms, and so it's okay. You know, like you don't have to hoard it. In some way, I think it's a kind of knowledge hoarding, and I think that's so good. Just raise your standard and just be okay with, yep, that's interesting, but I'm gonna leave it. Watch the video of Waz talking about World War II. Like, oh, too detailed. I'm not a combat leader or whatever. He's something like that. It's like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna leave that because that's not my thing. You know, I think that's such great advice.
I wonder if you could say it this way, like what you're trying to create almost are like creative associations that aren't going to exist out there in the world. So they're kind of like rare and really special. But
Mm,
all of those creative associations are built with knowledge that is sort of contained in lots of different places. There's lots of redundancy in the sort of concepts that exist out there in many different articles. So you don't have to feel bad about it. Uh, like you're losing some sort of like gem or gold when you don't extract it from
mm,
this one article. It will probably come up again.
Mm.
It's the actual creative
mm,
associations that are rare, and those will just come to you over time, I guess.
mm,
Yeah, it's a bit like your example of error correction and of coming across a situation where you don't fix something originally, but then you come across it again and again and again, and you realize, okay, this is increased in priority.
Mm,
Now I see the world is telling me, the universe is telling me this is actually more important than I originally thought.
mm,
And then you go back and learn that. And I actually think that is a core part of self-directed learning. And it's a reason why the idea of linear curriculums don't make sense to me anymore as a teacher, um, because it seems so obvious that you need to learn arithmetic before you learn algebra, and it seems so obvious that you need to learn algebra before you learn calculus. Like, how could you do one without the other?
mm,
But the thing is, even though that might be the order in which you'll eventually end up learning it, it's not necessarily going to be the order in which you get interested in maths,
mm,
and it's not necessarily going to be the order in which you're introduced to it in real life. And so, to give you an example from music, going back to those violin items and so on, um, obviously, music teachers want their students to learn scales because how can you play a piece of music if you can't even play simple notes? It doesn't seem to make logical sense.
mm,
mm,
But in fact, I think you absolutely can play music without learning scales, and obviously there's many scales to learn on each instrument. And so, after learning a couple of basic scales, I well, I guess this is also a relevant point in learning violin. I spent many years learning on my own without a teacher. After I'd had a teacher to learn some of the basics, I spent at least 5 years just studying on my own.
mm,
And when you study on your own, like I didn't push myself to practice scales. I was like, well, why would I do that boring stuff? So then I just tried to find some pieces that I would enjoy playing, and what naturally happened is I hit a ceiling. And when I hit that ceiling, I realized to get better at these pieces, I'm going to have to go back to my scales. And so, yes, eventually I did learn the scales before I learned the pieces, but I needed to come to that conclusion on my own. It's like that bad judgment, good judgment story as well. And so, there is a logical order between information, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily the order you should be learning things in. I think you should just go for what's most interesting. And if you hit a roadblock, use that as a signal to go back and learn the basics.
Absolutely. And that matches my experience ever since I was a little kid. Like, unfortunately, the only examples I can give here are like programming related. So I apologize. But like in CSS, for example, I'll go over this quickly. In CSS, for example, I would learn like groups of styles before I learned even what each style did. I just knew, oh, I'm trying to make something look like this. And in the past, when I put these styles on it, it went from looking like this to looking like this. And so even though I didn't even really know what those styles did, I was just trying to figure it out. I was trying to make something work. And it's the same thing with like SQL or ORMs or these kinds of things. Again, I apologize for the non-programmers. But the point is, it's possible to learn the theoretical next step in something before you're supposed to, and then only backfill it when you actually need the more detailed knowledge, like George was mentioning. I think that's a hugely valuable point. And I wrote a few weeks back about this phenomenon I've observed in my own learning, where I'll want to learn something new, and so I'll frenetically I'll just like read and watch videos for hours and try and figure something out and make a real project if it's that kind of thing. Then I'll get like burnt out within the same day, and I'll just go, I'm gonna leave this. And then like some months or weeks later, I come back to it because I need that. And then it all fits together perfectly. And like it's so much better than the last time I tried to learn it. And so I think it's all, I don't know, I just think you can learn way better if you just wait for your own natural inclinations and natural use cases.
Well, and to your point, I mean, I'm kind of the designated intellectual troglodyte of the group here, so I'll bring us back down to the meathead level for everyone. So, like, I'm definitely not the intellectual super heavyweight you guys are, but I do know a decent amount about physical training, and like this is exactly what like every person who has ever done any amount of physical training knows, is that it's not about optimality, it's about adherence. And the is to find thing that will allow you to stay with it long enough to put in sufficient repetition to where you get good at the thing, and you develop that love, interest, that passion. It keeps you good. It allows you to invest sufficient time to get good at the thing. I mean, that's the goal of every personal training session with a client, is about finding movements and patterns that they'll adhere to, or nutritional strategies that a person will adhere to. It doesn't matter if you have the perfect diet or the perfect training plan, perfect sleep schedule, if you never do the thing,
Right.
I don't know, it's like it's such a great parallel to physical training in all aspects. It's always about adherence, and finding that thing will allow you to just stick with it long enough.
Absolutely. A perfect plan is useless if you abandon it.
Yeah. I was also thinking, and hopefully I can steal this example before Xander gives it. It'll make me sound smarter. I know Peter Attia has talked about teaching calculus to his daughter when they were playing in the pool. I'm sure you remember the example, right? You know, they were doing stuff in a pool, and they're talking about, you know, fluid dynamics and taking integrals and talking about volumes of water and how you can calculate things, and using some basic calculus in order to do that. And she's like 12, right? 12 or 13, something like that. I mean, you know, she hasn't taken quote unquote the right math in order to understand that, but you can learn something at any time if you have sufficient interest and motivation to do it.
Absolutely.
Yes. The brain has an infinite ability to connect things. It's like I've always found it kind of weird. I don't know, I just had this thought one day that you can relate any two things in your mind, even if it's arbitrary. You're not like restricted from doing that in any way, even if there's no logical or supposedly, logical, I guess in quotes, connection between them. You're still able to connect them. There's nothing barring you from doing that. So it's like, given that anything can be related to your prior knowledge somehow, it means that, it doesn't make sense to see knowledge as a sort of hierarchy where you have to fill in the lower layers before you go up and up and up. It's more like a network, I suppose, but maybe even that isn't sufficient to. It's more like a network in the sense that any two nodes can sort of be connected somehow, even if it's arbitrary. But yeah, I don't even know if a graph or a network is enough to express actually how much connectivity is possible, just because it seems like, it just seems like there's nothing you can't connect in your mind somehow.
And if you want a great example of real-time high-stakes connection making, this is obscure, but there's this guy, a stand-up comedian, some British white guy who raps, and I'm saying white guy because that's how he refers to himself in the titles of the videos. If you look up like white guy freestyles or something, what this guy does is miraculous. He'll be on stage at a comedy club and he'll have people throw out like 10 words or whatever, and then he'll do a freestyle rap right off the top of his head about those words, and he'll find a way to connect them all and make it rhyme, and it flows well. It's really incredible stuff. So he's finding ways to connect essentially anything in real time, high stakes. It's great.
Dude, everyone needs to look him up. He was on James Altucher's podcast. I am blanking on his name, but it is so incredibly cool. Like,
yeah, it's
everyone
awesome.
has to find him.
I think his first name is Chris. I think what'd you say, George?
I've also seen that too. It's great.
Yeah, it's awesome. I think his first name is Chris, and if anybody wants to watch that, it's good. Anyway, I didn't mean to derail it, but I genuinely think it's related.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. You need to. I'm going to watch that after this and then try and channel that in my incremental reading.
Fantastic. Love it, dude. Anyway, all right. Anybody else have any questions, or should we wrap it up here?
Hello.
Hello.
I blew my intellectual load, so I'm done.
Yeah. I have one question related to incremental writing. Because it's about, learning is about making connections. But once you have those, you can focus on output. And I think when you are a long-term user, as George was, you can make your own generalizations you made and making new connections when you are focusing on output. My question is, could you elaborate more on your process of incremental writing and how it's different with incremental learning?
Sure. Yeah, well, I think one obvious difference between me and Woz is that he writes 1,000 articles every week, and I don't publish like he does. The thing is, I mean, when I wrote to him about my process and what I actually use now, for me, the writing and the reading fit together as part of the learning process. And so I do incremental writing less for content creation. I guess that's the thing, is I use the writing process as a part of the learning process. So if I've just read a bunch of semi-related things and I'm trying to pull the pieces together, like that rap comedian, I'm trying to pull the pieces together myself. Often, again, this won't be like something I'm forcing myself to do. It'll be more like I've read a bunch of stuff recently and I might go for a walk, or I might wake up in the morning and go, oh, I see how the pieces fit together. And so I'll just write a little bit down for myself. And I guess one reason why I don't publish much is because the way my process for incremental writing works is it's just me trying to understand the things I'm learning. And so I won't often write an article with an introduction and a conclusion and this sort of structure. I'll normally write like several paragraphs that just relate to what I'm learning. And so my process is like, to give you a bit more of a practical idea of my process, I basically, during the day when I'm going just away from my computer, I use my phone to take notes. As soon as an idea comes into my head, I'll just write down the idea in a single note. And then another idea, I'll write down in a single note. Then after a few days, normally at the end of the week, I take this single note with like, I don't know, 50 ideas maybe, and I'll import it into my incremental reading. At the moment, I import it into Dendro, but it's the same thing. Then I come across that note in Dendro after a few days, and I see these ideas that I've typed on my phone. Obviously, I'm using one finger on my phone. I could only write a few words. So when I'm on my computer, that's a good point for me to expand what I was talking about and think about it a bit more deeply. And I'll often turn it into a few paragraphs. And then it's one really interesting thing I've found with this is that I hardly ever feel like it's worth making items out of my own incremental writing because it works. It's like the reason I'm writing it is because I've made these connections in my brain from everything else I've got in my reading process. And so it's almost like I'm just writing down what was already there in my brain. And so very often I end up doing this writing in SuperMemo and then just dismissing it. And then I don't come across it again. But then I often notice that like years later, I'm still thinking about it in the same way because I made those connections. The big picture was clarified, and then all the other reading and writing I do in SuperMemo just maintains it. So I don't have a really good process, maybe like was for turning it into content, turning it into articles. For me, it's mostly a process of trying to make sense of what I'm learning, trying to find what's interesting, and then just doing those two things a bit on my phone, just writing short notes, and then on SuperMemo, fleshing them out.
I think that's really interesting. I actually feel differently about making items from my own notes because over time I tend to forget even my own like models of reality, so to say. And I do find that like item making about my own interpretations of things, at least as it stands right now, can be really helpful, at least for me.
Yeah, I would
Yeah, I mean,
agree. Although I feel like I kind of split the difference between you two guys, and maybe George doesn't actually disagree, but I agree 100% with what you said, George. I think all of us who do incremental writing have all noticed that, like, anytime you do that elaborative interrogation or interrogative elaboration, I don't remember what it's called exactly, but where basically you're interrogating the text and writing it out so that you understand it for yourself. Those connections are so strong, and they just last. It seems almost like indefinitely, but I agree also with Xander that I do typically make an item, but I find I only have to make like maybe 1 to 3 items that captures like the overall structure of what I was thinking, and then I just don't forget it at all.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I also agree with Xander. Like, I do make items. I guess I have to clarify what I meant by not making items. This is part of the idea of formulation and generalization. The general idea, I don't feel like I really need to make items most of the time, but sometimes I come up with like something that I think is a good metaphor or analogy. I make an item out of that, or make some
Right,
items.
okay. We're on the
Sometimes I
same
come up
page.
with like a nice way to phrase it, and it's a nice, I come up with something that I think, oh, that's a nice way to say it, and then I'll put that into items. But the general
Right.
idea, the big picture, doesn't necessarily go into items for me.
Yeah, it sounds like we're pretty much on the same page there then.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah. Anyway, all right. This was great fun. I hope people got value out of it, and we'll get value out of the actual podcast once we post it. But anyway, just to wrap it up here, if you're interested in this kind of thing and you're a SuperMemo user now, or you're interested in these ideas and you think SuperMemo is a little bit tough to tackle, I personally recommend that you check out Denvo because George and I and Ollie try to make it as good as we can make it and very approachable and try to incorporate some of these ideas we're talking about into it and trying to improve on some of the metric stuff like we talked about and more. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, check it out. Also, check out Matt Nielsen's Substack. This guy, he doesn't just talk about incremental writing. This guy does it all the time, and he's actually posting a bunch of articles. And Georgios's blog as well. What is that? Georgios.blog.
Yeah.
All of these links will
And
be in
check
the
out
description.
James as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Follow me on Twitter.
Fantastic. Beautiful.
All right. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Thanks.
See ya.
See ya.